The screaming from the north wing of the big house at Ardmore did not stop when the sun came up. It only went hoarse. On the wide bed in the middle of that sealed room, Raphael Marchetti lay on his side with both hands clamped around his right thigh, just above the knee, just above the empty air. 7 months ago, they had taken the leg below that knee. 7 months later, the foot that no longer existed was still burning. The 3 best nerve specialists on the East Coast had come here with expensive machines and vials of medicine whose names ran half a line long, and all 3 of them had walked away, because no man can cut into a place where the scans come back clean and white. The man whose name made the whole Providence waterfront lower its voice was losing to something he could not buy, could not threaten, and could not shoot. In the corner of the room, the carbon fiber leg stood upright under a film of dust, and no one dared touch it. On the table, the pain medicine the doctor had left behind sat unopened in its box, because Rafe would sooner grind his teeth until they bled than reach for it, and the whole family simply thought he was being stubborn. Then the door opened. The woman who walked in carried no needle, no machine, and no license either, because hers had been taken from her last winter, along with a name that had been printed on the front page of every paper in the city. She set a basin of cold water on the floor, pulled a chair up close to the edge of the bed, and sat down while he was still screaming. She offered him no words of comfort. She only looked at the one lamp still burning in that room, drew a slow breath, and began to sing. If Rafe and Sloane's story stayed with you tonight, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments which moment made you go quiet, and subscribe to our channel so you can walk with us through the stories still waiting ahead. 3 days before that night, Sloane Merrick sat in her 15-year-old car in the parking lot behind the rehabilitation center and counted the money for the 4th time. The total hadn't changed. $19, one $10 bill, 1 5, 3 ones, and a handful of loose change she had dug out from between the seats that morning. She smoothed the bills flat, folded them in half, then tucked them into the inner compartment of her wallet, as though arranging them neatly might somehow make them multiply. On the steering wheel lay an envelope she had torn open with her thumb because she hadn't wanted to go looking for a letter opener. A fee reminder. White paper, black print, the language polite to the point of cruelty. The kind of politeness used by someone writing to a person they had never met and had no need to meet. Beneath the greeting was a number, and beneath the number was a date. After that date, her sister's place would be given to someone else on the waiting list. Sloane read the letter twice, not because she didn't understand it, but because she was waiting for something inside her chest to settle before she raised her head. Beyond the wide glass wall of the therapy room, Junie stood between 2 parallel bars, both hands gripping them tightly, and the girl saw her sister. She let go with one hand to wave, nearly lost her balance, then caught hold again and burst out laughing at herself. A yellow bow sat in her hair, the one she had shown off all the way there that morning, turning her head from side to side in the rearview mirror until her sister admitted it was beautiful. Sloane lifted her hand and waved back. She smiled. She held that smile until Junie turned away and took another step, and only then did she let it fall. On the passenger seat, beneath the folded coat she used as a pillow, lay the local newspaper she had picked up at the laundromat. She had circled one advertisement in ballpoint pen, tracing the circle again and again until the paper had nearly torn. Night shift housekeeper. Private residence outside the city. Paid weekly in cash. No background check. No references required. The wage printed directly beneath those words was so high that if this had been someone else's story, she would have warned them not to be foolish. But she had lived long enough in the world of help-wanted ads to understand one simple truth. People didn't pay 3 times the usual rate merely to have someone clean their house. They paid 3 times as much when the job had already driven away everyone who came before, and when they needed someone who wouldn't ask questions. The 2 smallest lines in the advertisement, the 2 lines everyone else would have skimmed past, were the very lines that told her everything she needed to know. No background check meant they were desperate, and desperate people didn't care where her name had once appeared in print. She pulled open the small compartment beneath the dashboard to look for a pen. Her employee identification card lay inside, face up, bearing a photograph of a woman who looked far younger than she did now, though not nearly that much time had passed. A woman who knew nothing yet, and was smiling because someone had told her to smile. She looked at it for a few seconds. Then she reached in with 2 fingers, turned the card face down, and closed the compartment again. Her phone lay silent on the console, its screen dark. It had been silent that way since the previous winter. No one called. No one sent a message. Some evenings, she picked it up only to check whether it still had a signal. and every time it did, and that was what made the emptiness feel so complete. She dialed the number printed beneath the advertisement. The phone rang twice. A man's voice answered, dry and curt, without giving a name. She said she was calling about the night shift position. The other end remained silent for a long time, so long that she thought he had hung up. Then the voice asked her a single question. Not about her experience, not about her qualifications. He asked whether she was afraid of screaming. Sloane looked through the glass, where her sister had just released both hands from the parallel bars and stood alone for a count of 3, her face glowing with pride. She said no. The man gave her an address and told her to arrive before dark. She ended the call, set the phone down, and sat motionless for a little while longer in the cold car. Then she started the engine. The road leading out of the city grew narrower and narrower, and by the time the sun began to sink, there was nothing on either side but banks of scorched grass and rows of gray stone walls. She rounded a bend and saw the gate. It didn't look like the gate to a house. It was tall and black, and it opened slowly before she had a chance to ring the bell, which meant someone had seen her car long before she ever saw the gate. Inside, the gravel drive curved around a lawn so vast that it took her eyes a moment to find the house at the far end of her view. A man stood waiting on the front steps, his hands resting loosely in front of his stomach. He wasn't smoking or looking at his phone. He was simply standing there. He appeared to be in his late 40s, with hair clipped short in a military style, and the way he watched her car approach wasn't the way someone watched a guest. It was the way someone measured an object. He introduced himself as Bishop Pharaoh, offering no title, then told her to place her purse on the small table just inside the entrance hall. A metal detector stood immediately beyond the front threshold, the kind she had only ever seen in courthouses and airports, and it sounded when she walked through because of her belt buckle. Bishop told her to walk through again. Then he opened her purse, neither hurried nor rough, and removed each item one by one, arranging them in a neat row on the table. Her wallet, her keys, a box of cold medicine with half a blister pack remaining, a ballpoint pen. He picked up the pen, turned it in his hand, removed the cap, peered inside the barrel, then set it aside and didn't give it back. Sloane didn't ask why. She had lived through enough in the past 14 months to know that when someone held the thing you needed, questions were the most expensive luxury of all. In one corner of the entrance hall, a man in an expensive gray suit sat in a leather chair, both hands resting neatly on his knees. He wasn't looking at his phone or reading anything. A member of the household staff told her that he had been sitting there since morning, and not once all day had anyone called his name. Bishop led her down the hallway, and the house unsettled her in a very peculiar way. It was warm. The lights were bright. The hardwood floors had been polished until they reflected the ceiling. Yet it was as silent as a courtroom before the verdict. The silence of a place filled with people who were all trying not to make a sound. In the study at the end of the hall, an old man sat behind a desk. His hair was white, his shoulders still broad, his face carved with lines that age alone couldn't have made without help from something else. He introduced himself as Augusto Marchetti, told her to call him Gus, then gestured toward the chair across from him. He didn't ask what she had done before. He didn't ask why a woman her age was looking for work as a night housekeeper in a place 40 minutes outside the city. He pushed the contract across the desk and told her to read the job title carefully. It clearly said housekeeper. There was no mention of a nurse. He went on to say that this was the first condition, and the one condition that couldn't be negotiated. She would be paid to keep one room clean and make sure one man drank enough water, and if anyone asked, that was all she did there. Sloane reached for her pen, then remembered that it had been taken from her, and Gus slid his own pen across the desk. As she signed, she understood why she had been chosen. They didn't need someone who knew the profession. They needed someone with nothing left to lose by signing a document built on a lie. Then Gus leaned back in his chair and gave her 3 rules, his voice as steady as a man reading an inventory report. First, she was never to touch his grandson's right leg for any reason, no matter how necessary it might seem. Second, she wasn't to mention hospitals, doctors, or anything that smelled of antiseptic. Third, he paused here longer than he had for the first 2 rules. She must never pity him. He said his grandson could endure pain. He could even endure people being afraid of him. But what he couldn't endure was the look in the eyes of someone who thought he was pitiful. Gus spoke in that same measured voice until the final 3 words, and then his voice broke, only for the briefest moment. So brief that she would have missed it if she had blinked. He lowered his head and straightened the contract until its edges aligned perfectly, and when he looked up again, his voice had returned to normal. He told her Bishop would take her to the north wing before darkness fell completely. Because after that, no one in the house wanted to go in that direction anymore. Bishop led her to the top of the grand staircase, then turned into a hallway where only every other light was on, and the farther they went, the longer the stretches of darkness became. He stopped before a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, handed her a small flashlight, and said they didn't turn on the overhead lights inside. Then he stepped back twice and stood there. He didn't open the door for her or say anything more, and Sloane understood that from this threshold onward, no one would be going with her. The smell reached her before she could see anything. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for too long, the smell of bedding that hadn't been changed often enough, of antiseptic soap gone stale, and beneath it all, the sharp, sour odor of a body that had remained in one place for months. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Only a small table lamp glowed in the far corner of the room, and its light wasn't strong enough to reach the bed in the center. A voice rose from the darkness, hoarse and worn raw, the voice of a man who had used up his throat screaming. It told her to get out. Before she could answer, something flew toward her. It struck the wall about 2 handspans from her head and shattered, and the fragments of glass pattered onto the hardwood floor like hail against a metal roof. Sloane didn't jump back. She didn't scream. She stood still until the final shard stopped rolling, then reached behind her, found the lock, and turned it. In the silence of that room, the click of the lock sounded louder than the breaking glass. She told him he had missed. Her voice was so calm that even she found it strange. In the darkness, the rhythm of his breathing changed, the rhythm of a man who had just lost his momentum. The man on the bed asked who she was. She gave him her name and said she had been hired as the night housekeeper. He told her he didn't need a housekeeper. He needed someone to bring him something that would end this. She set the basin of water on the floor and said the only things she had brought were her 2 hands, and if he wanted her out of the room, he would have to get up and remove her himself, and given his present condition, she felt fairly confident about her chances. A long silence followed. Then he laughed, a short, dry sound with no trace of amusement in it, and it died almost at once because something inside his body wouldn't allow it to last. He asked whether she knew how long the people before her had stayed. She said she didn't care. He said the longest anyone had lasted was 9 days. She told him she would break the record because she had nowhere else to go and no one waiting for her anywhere, and that was an advantage the other 8 hadn't possessed. He fell silent. She heard fabric rubbing against fabric as he shifted, followed by the very slow intake of breath from someone trying to keep something from rising inside him. She walked to the table lamp, sat down in the wooden chair beside it, and didn't take another step toward the bed. That was when she heard the vibration. A phone lying somewhere on the nightstand lit up in the darkness, casting a pale blue streak across the ceiling. A hand reached out and picked it up, and when the voice spoke again, it had become an entirely different voice. It was no longer hoarse, no longer worn raw, and there was no trace of the man who had spent the entire afternoon lying there screaming. It was low, steady, slow, and utterly unhurried. The voice said 3 containers. Then it said, ask him a second time. Then it said, if I have to go ask him myself the 3rd time, I won't ask again. The phone went dark. The blue light on the ceiling disappeared. Sloane sat motionless in the wooden chair, both hands resting on her thighs. And in that darkness, she could hear her own heart with perfect clarity. Across the room, the man who had just decided the fate of someone whose face she would never know was breathing hard again, one breath at a time, as though each one had to be dragged up from somewhere very deep. Beyond the boarded window, the sea wind struck the wood. Neither of them spoke another word. The attack came near dawn, and it didn't come gradually. Sloane had been dozing in the wooden chair when the sound of the bedsheet being jerked taut snapped her awake. On the bed, the man had managed to sit halfway upright, both hands clamped around his right thigh, gripping the place just above the knee, gripping the empty space beneath it, his knuckles bleached white in the pale yellow glow of the table lamp. He wasn't screaming. That was worse than screaming. He clenched his teeth and made a sound from deep inside his chest, the kind of sound heard only from an animal with its leg caught in a trap. Sloane stood, but she didn't move closer. She remembered Gus's first rule, and she remembered why the old man had been forced to make it. He folded forward until his forehead touched his left knee, and between 2 broken breaths, he spoke the first words of the night that weren't meant to drive her away. He said it was burning. He said his foot was burning, that his toes were being bent backward, and someone was holding his entire foot over glowing coals. Then he stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice broke into something almost like laughter. The laughter of a man who could hear the absurdity of his own words. He said it wasn't even there. He said they had taken it away. Did she understand? They had taken it away, and it was still burning. Sloane understood. She had read about this in books she no longer had the right to open, and she knew that what was happening in this room wasn't in his leg. It was in a severed pathway of signals, and a brain that still stubbornly insisted everything remained intact. She knew there was no knife that could reach that place. She looked toward the small table, where the box of medication the doctor had left behind still sat unopened, its seal unbroken. She didn't touch it. She didn't go to the door and call anyone either. She knew perfectly well that if she called, Bishop would come upstairs, and Bishop would call someone else, and that person would arrive carrying a syringe, and then the only thing left in this room would be a fight. She drew the wooden chair a little closer, only a little, then sat down. She didn't look at him. She looked at the table lamp in the corner, at its tiny circle of light, and drew in a very slow breath. She had been counting his breaths from the moment he sat up. She knew how fast his heart was racing, and she began at a rhythm 10 beats slower than his, then held it there, never speeding up, never slowing down, never once allowing the panic in that room to drag her along with it. It was an old seafaring folk song, one her aunt used to sing in the kitchen on winter afternoons in a small town where Sloane no longer had anyone to return to, a song about men who went out to sea, and the lamps left burning in windows to wait for them. She sang very softly, barely loud enough to make the air in the room tremble. He told her to be quiet. She didn't stop. He said his head was about to split open. She kept the same rhythm. She sang the verse to the end, then began again, then reached the end again and returned once more to the beginning. And by the third time, she realized he had stopped telling her to be quiet. She sang it twice more. Her throat began to burn. When she let the final note dissolve into the darkness, the room fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence from the beginning of the night. She looked over. His fingers had released the bedsheet. His hand lay palm up on the blanket, soft and open, the knuckles pink again. His chest was still rising and falling quickly, but it was no longer the rhythm of a man being dragged beneath the water. He lay still for a long time, his eyes remaining closed, and then he said in that voice worn down to nothing that she sang like someone rubbing sandpaper across a plank of wood. Sloane reached for the glass of water on the table and took a sip to soothe her throat. She told him he behaved like a dog cornered against a wall, then added that she meant no offense to anyone. She was merely describing exactly what she had observed. In the darkness, one corner of his mouth lifted once, very quickly, then disappeared. The next morning, she went down to the kitchen for fresh water, and on her way back upstairs, she passed Gus's study. The door stood open by about a handspan. Inside, Bishop was speaking, his voice even in the way of a man reporting that a task had been completed. He said the number 40. He said they had screened 40 files and narrowed them down to exactly 3 names that met the criteria. Then he said the criteria had come from Rafe himself, 1 line and nothing more. Sloane stopped in the middle of the hallway with the water pitcher in her hands. She heard Gus ask something very quietly, and Bishop replied that this woman had been the best choice of the 3, because the other 2 still had family in the city. She stood there longer than necessary. Then she continued upstairs, entered the room, set down the pitcher, and asked him directly. She asked how many files he had read before choosing her. The man on the bed was sitting against a stack of pillows, his eyes still closed because the daylight slipping through the gaps in the boards bothered him. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't pretend not to understand. He said 40. Sloane placed both hands on the back of the chair and said she had thought she was lucky. She said she had believed that advertisement was a loophole, that there was one place in the world where no one checked backgrounds, and she had somehow happened to slip through. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He said there were no loopholes in this house, and no such thing as luck. There were only calculations, and she should get used to that as soon as possible. She asked what the criteria had been. He was silent for a moment. Then he told her, using the same calm voice he had used to speak about 3 containers in the darkness the night before, the voice of a man reading out a number rather than speaking about a human being. He said 3 of the finest doctors on the East Coast had walked away, so he didn't need another talented person. He said he needed someone who could walk out through those gates tomorrow and tell the entire city that Raphael Marchetti lay in bed crying like a child, and not one person in the world would believe a single word she said. He said that among those 40 files, Only 3 people fit that description, and she was the only one who had no one left to lose. When he finished, he fell silent. He didn't add anything to soften it. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't tell her she had done well over the past 2 nights. He simply looked at her and waited. Sloane stood there and felt the one thing she had carefully refused to let herself feel for the past 14 months. The feeling of someone who had just been reminded that her greatest value now lay in the fact that she had been destroyed. She thought of the fee reminder in the drawer of her car. She thought of the yellow bow. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She said nothing. She picked up the dirty tray from the table, turned, walked to the door, and closed it softly behind her. So softly that it didn't make a sound. Inside the room, the man who had just spoken that truth sat motionless for a long time, his eyes fixed on the closed door, and for the first time in many months, the silence of that room became something he couldn't bear. 3 nights later, the fever came. Sloane knew before anyone told her, because that afternoon, when she carried the tray upstairs, he didn't order her out and didn't say anything at all, and his sudden compliance sent a colder chill down her spine than a glass flying past her head ever could. By evening, his face was flushed deep red and his lips had cracked from dryness, and he was calling the name of someone she had never heard of. Bishop summoned Dr. Weller in less than an hour. The old physician entered with his brown leather bag, examined him once, then said 2 words: an infection. He said the area where the metal brace had been attached was swollen and intravenous antibiotics had to be started immediately. Then added that they first needed to make the man lie still. He opened his bag and took out a vial of sedative. Sloane saw it and opened her mouth to speak, but she was half a beat too slow. The instant the needle touched his skin, Rafe's left arm swung out, and it moved with the strength of a man who had once commanded an entire harbor, not a man who had been confined to a bed for so long. Weller was thrown backward into the edge of the cabinet. His leather bag fell to the floor, spilling everything inside it across the room. 2 of Bishop's men rushed forward and seized Rafe's arms. The old doctor rose, his face drained white, one hand clutching his shoulder, and shouted at them to hold him down. Sloane stepped into the middle of the room and spoke in a voice she hadn't known she still possessed. She told everyone to get out. No one moved. Weller turned toward her and asked who she was to give orders in that room, and Sloane said she was the person who would remain there all night while everyone else returned to their own beds, and if he injected that drug into Rafe now, by morning he would have a patient who woke up remembering exactly who had done what to him. She spoke the final sentence very quietly. Weller stared at her for a long time. Then he bent down, picked up his bag, left the antibiotic vial and the intravenous tubing on the table, and walked out. The other 2 men followed. Bishop was the last to leave, and he stopped at the threshold, turned his head to look at her, then closed the door without saying a word. Sloane locked it. She went to the sink, ran the water until it was ice cold, wrung out a cloth, and began doing the work she had still possessed the credentials to do 14 months earlier, and no longer did. She placed the cloth on his forehead, along both sides of his neck, and over his wrists. She counted his breaths. She started the intravenous line, and her hands performed the task with such clean precision that it hurt her, because the human body remembered what a piece of paper could take away. Then the delirium came. He was no longer in that room. He spoke of smoke, of a jammed compartment door, and he called that name again, twice, then 3 times, and between each call, he tried to sit up and move towards some place only he could see. Sloane held his left wrist, not pinning it down, simply holding it, and spoke into his left ear, telling him he was in his own bed, that the sea was outside, and dawn was coming. He couldn't hear her, so she sang. This time, it wasn't the seafaring folk song. She sang an aria she had once sung in the old place, one that required each breath to be taken precisely, and every note to be held without trembling, one she hadn't dared open her mouth to sing since the previous winter. Its very absurdity was what made it work. A woman in an old gray sweater stood singing opera in a boarded room at the end of a dark hallway, and the man drowning in smoke suddenly found something so clear and unmistakable that it couldn't possibly belong to that dream. He stopped struggling. Bishop had once tried playing music in the room for an entire week, and it had done nothing. Weller had once brought in a machine that played the sounds of waves and rain, and that had done nothing either. It wasn't the sound that made the difference. What made the difference was that someone was willing to remain in the room long enough. Sloane sang until the cloth on his forehead grew warm, then she soaked it again and continued singing. She sat on the edge of the bed for 5 hours, her left hand holding his wrist, her right hand changing the cloth, and her throat grew so raw that every swallow hurt. When the first gray light seeped through the cracks between the boards, the heat in his forehead began to recede. He opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, then turned his head and saw her sitting there with the wet cloth in her hand and her hair clinging to her temples. In a voice reduced to a whisper, he asked what she had done to him. Sloane wrung the cloth out over the basin. She said she couldn't heal his leg, and she wanted him to understand that clearly from this moment forward. She said she had only given his mind something else to do while his leg screamed, and that was the entirety of her work, and there were no miracles in that room. After that night, Sloane began to understand something about the house that she had missed during her first few days there. Once every few days, usually in the late afternoon, the sound of shoes would climb the staircase to the north wing. There was never any conversation. The visitors would come upstairs, stop in the dark hallway, stand straight, and speak into the closed wooden door. Some gave their names first, others went directly to business, talking about a shipment being held at the South Pier, about someone demanding a larger percentage, about a man in the union who had begun speaking to people he shouldn't be speaking to. They spoke to a door. No one was permitted to open it. Inside, the man propped against a stack of pillows answered with one sentence, sometimes two, and his voice would become the same voice from the night of the 3 containers, low and even, without the slightest trace of haste. Then the shoes would descend the stairs again, and Sloane knew that somewhere beyond that house, down at the Providence docks, things were beginning to move because of a sentence heard only by her and the man who had spoken it. That kept her awake more than the attacks of pain. An entire machine had continued to run smoothly all this time, and every part of it believed that the man controlling it was still whole, because none of them had been allowed to see him since the night at the docks. She was the only person in the world on the other side of that door. She heard both things. She heard the voice that made grown men straighten their backs in the hallway, and she heard the ragged breathing that broke loose the instant the last footsteps disappeared at the bottom of the stairs, the breathing of a man who had spent everything he had left simply to speak for 30 seconds without trembling. One afternoon, just after the footsteps had gone, the door opened again. Bishop entered without knocking, walked directly to the small table beneath the window, and placed a stack of printed pages on it nearly as thick as the first joint of a finger. He said nothing. He simply set it down, then stepped back and stood beside the cabinet, with his hands folded in front of his stomach, in the exact posture he had held on the front steps the day she drove up to the house. Sloane was changing the water in the pitcher. She saw her name printed in bold on the first line, and beneath it was a photograph of her walking down the steps of a building she had tried to forget. She set the pitcher down. She didn't walk to the table. She didn't pick up the papers. She remained where she was and spoke before anyone had a chance to ask her a question. She said she wasn't a nurse. She said she had once been one, and she had worked at a place whose doors she was no longer permitted to enter, and her nursing license had been revoked the previous winter. She added that she wouldn't explain any of it because she had spent months explaining herself to people who had never intended to listen, and she no longer had the strength for it. She said she wasn't a nurse anymore. She was a headline. Bishop looked toward the bed. Rafe said nothing for so long that Sloane began calculating how much time it would take her to pack. He looked at her. He looked for a long time, and it wasn't the look of a man deciding whether to dismiss someone. It was the look of a man recognizing something familiar in a place where he had never expected to find it. Then he reached out, picked up the stack of papers from the table, and didn't open it. He lifted it, then dropped it back onto the tabletop. A small, clean, decisive gesture, the gesture of someone pushing an unwanted item aside. He said 4 newspapers had written about him the previous summer, and all 4 had described him as something already dead. He said they had written her the same way they had written him. He said both people in that room were creations shaped by the press, and the only difference was that he still had enough money to force them to take the stories down, while she didn't. He turned to Bishop and told him to take the papers downstairs and burn them. Bishop picked up the file and left. The door closed. Sloane stood there with the water pitcher in her hands, and for the first time since walking through those black gates, she felt the floor beneath her feet become level. It happened on a morning in late October, when she carried the tray upstairs, and he didn't touch it or say anything, but simply lay facing the wall, as he always did whenever it was daylight outside. Sloane set the tray down and watched the food grow cold. Then she set it. She said he could command an entire harbor through a wooden door, yet he didn't dare let daylight into his own room, and of those two things, only one seemed real to her. She said they had taken part of his leg, not his courage, yet he was lying there, throwing away what remained with his own hands. She spoke the word she had been holding in her mouth for days. She called him a coward. This time, his anger was real. He turned all the way around, propped himself on one elbow, and the voice that burst from him was no longer hoarse. It was raw and sharp, a voice the men standing in the hallway had surely never heard. He asked what she knew about any of this. He asked whether she had ever been trapped somewhere with smoke on all four sides, whether she had ever been forced to make a decision when none of the choices were right. And he said she had been in that room for only a few days and already dared to lecture him about courage. Sloane didn't argue a single word. She walked to the desk drawer, took out the utility knife she had noticed there on her first day, and went straight to the large window. He told her not to touch it. She placed the blade against the upper edge of the glass and drew it down in one long line, cutting through the dark film that had yellowed at the corners, and the sound of the blade tearing through the plastic was like cloth being ripped apart. He ordered her to stop immediately. She made a second cut. Then she pried up one edge with her fingernail, took hold of it, and tore the entire sheet of film from the glass in a single motion. Beneath it were wooden shutters. She released the latch and pushed both panels apart. Light flooded the room like water breaking through a shattered dam. It wasn't the golden sunlight of summer, but the gray-white brightness peculiar to the New England coast in late fall, a light without shadows that rose from the water and reflected onto the ceiling. Outside, the lawn sloped downward for nearly 200 yards before breaking against a long stone embankment, and below that embankment lay the Atlantic Ocean, gray as cold steel, rippling beneath the wind, and stretching all the way to a horizon where not a single ship could be seen. To the left stood a row of maple trees that had shed nearly all their leaves, with only a few dark red clusters still clinging to the highest branches as the sea wind blew through them without pause. The entire room suddenly revealed itself in that light, and it was far worse than she had imagined in the darkness. A fine layer of dust covered every surface. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, the hardwood floor had faded to the color of ash, and in the corner of the room, beneath that heavy dust, stood a carbon fiber prosthetic leg, glossy black where the dust hadn't completely covered it, brand new and never once used. Rafe raised his entire forearm across his face and swore. He swore loudly, in the language of the docks, and ordered her to close everything immediately. Sloane didn't. She pulled out the wooden chair, placed it in the center of the light spread across the floor, and sat down. She said his eyes would adjust. She said she had been sitting in darkness for 14 months, and she had no intention of sitting through another winter that way. 3 days later, when daylight had become something he no longer needed to shield his face from, Sloane walked to the corner of the room. She wiped the dust from the prosthetic leg, cleaning every part carefully, as someone might clean an object that was about to be used, then took hold of it and dragged it into the center of the floor. The end of the metal leg scraped across the hardwood, making a long, shrill sound in the silent room. He heard it before he had time to look. He told her to put it back where it belonged. She stood it upright beside the bedpost and said no. He told her she didn't understand anything. She said she understood perfectly, and that what frightened him wasn't the pain, because he had lived with pain for months and was still there. She said what frightened him was the click of the lock. She said that once he heard that sound, once it snapped into place and he knew it was secure, he would lose every excuse he had left to remain in that bed. Rafe looked at her, and for one very long moment, he couldn't speak. Then he threw back the blanket and sat on the edge of the bed. He wouldn't allow her to come closer. He did everything himself, and his hands trembled so badly that it took him 3 attempts to fit the liner, then the socket, then the lock. The click sounded through the room, tiny and clean, and afterward he sat motionless for nearly half a minute, his head lowered, breathing through his nose. Sloane didn't urge him on. She stepped back and stood beside the table with her arms at her sides, never once moving toward him. He planted both hands on the edge of the bed and pushed himself upward. He stood. For one moment, he stood straight in the middle of that room, far taller than the man she had imagined during all those weeks of lying awake and listening to his voice in the darkness. Then his weight shifted to the right, following a habit that had settled into his bones over more than 30 years, shifting onto a place that was no longer there, and he fell. He went down sideways, striking his shoulder against the edge of the nightstand as he fell. and the sound of a human body hitting a hardwood floor was a heavy, hollow sound that could never be forgotten once it had been heard. He lay face down with one cheek pressed against the floor, and Sloane saw the worst thing that happened that entire morning. It wasn't the fall. It was the moment he realized she was still standing there, watching him. She didn't rush toward him. She didn't cry out. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. She remained exactly where she was. And after enough time had passed for him to understand that no hand would be extended, she spoke, her voice as calm as if she were reading technical instructions. She said he had just placed all his weight on his right side, exactly where his leg had still been the previous summer. She said his body was still making calculations from an old map. She said that next time, he had to lean farther to the left than felt right, and that the wrong feeling was the right one. Rafe remained still. Then he raised both hands, braced them against the floor, and pushed himself up. He had to try twice. On the second attempt, he managed to reach his knees, then seized the bedpost and hauled his entire body upright, and by the time he was standing again, the back of his undershirt was soaked through. He looked toward the window. It was about 12 paces from where he stood. He leaned farther to the left than felt right, and took his first step. Sloane began to sing. It wasn't the seafaring folk song or the aria. She sang an old marching song, fast and steady, without a trace of pity, the kind of rhythm used to make a foot obey. He glared at her, but his left foot had already found the beat. On the 4th step, he swayed and had to reach for the back of the chair. On the 8th, he stopped completely and stood there breathing while she kept the rhythm unchanged. On the 11th, he nearly pitched forward, but caught himself with both hands against the windowsill. He remained there for a long time, his head lowered, his shoulders shaking as he dragged air into his lungs. Then he raised his head. Beyond the window was the sea, gray and vast and empty, while the wind tore the last clusters of red leaves from the row of maples on the left. He watched for a long time. Sloane stopped singing. She walked over, pulled the heavy armchair into place behind him, then stepped away. Once he had managed to sit down, he said thank you without turning around, and it was the first time he had spoken to her without anything sharp in his voice. That afternoon, after he had fallen asleep, Sloane went outside and sat on the steps behind the kitchen to call her sister. Junie appeared on the screen with her yellow bow tied crookedly to one side, and immediately announced that she had walked the entire length of the hallway by herself that day, and that she had a new song. The song was about a seagull that stole French fries from an old man on the pier, then was chased by an entire flock of other gulls demanding their share. Junie sang almost the whole song off beat, forgot 2 lines in the middle, and invented 2 worse ones to replace them, then burst out laughing at herself so hard that she had to set the tablet down. Sloane laughed with her, and this time her laughter was real. She laughed until her eyes watered in the sea wind. She heard nothing behind her. In the hallway on the 3rd floor, beyond a wooden door standing open by the narrowest crack, a man leaned against the frame with one hand resting on the doorknob, listening to the entire song about the seagull and the laughter of a girl he had never met, and listening to the laughter of the woman he had known for weeks only as someone who never laughed. He didn't open the door. He stood there until the song ended, then closed it very softly and walked the 12 steps back to the chair beside the window on his own. That week, visitors began coming back to the house, and the man who came most often was Cormac Doyle, the man in charge of the South Docks, the kind of man who smiled a great deal and smiled at everyone, except when he thought no one was watching. Sloane ran into him one evening in the narrow hallway connecting the kitchen to the back staircase, while she was carrying a pitcher of water upstairs. He stood squarely in the middle of the passage, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and showed no intention of moving aside. He looked her over slowly from head to toe, and then he recited it. He recited the newspaper headline word for word, from memory, without stumbling once, including the phrase at the end that the other papers had left out. Then he asked her, still in that pleasant voice, who she planned to let die this time. Sloane didn't slap him. She stood still, looked him straight in the eyes, and said that a man who could memorize a 14-month-old newspaper headline was either terribly bored or had gone to a great deal of trouble to look it up before walking into this house, and she said she wasn't sure which of those 2 possibilities made him look more pathetic. Doyle's smile vanished. His face went pale for exactly 1 beat, that very brief moment when a man realizes someone has touched the place he thought no one could see. He stepped aside. Sloane walked up the stairs at exactly the same pace she walked every day, not 1 step faster. 3 nights later, Bishop wasn't home. That afternoon, word had come of trouble in Fall River. Something serious enough that someone trusted had to go there in person, and the man who suggested sending Bishop was Doyle. Sloane wouldn't learn that until much later. All she knew was that when she carried the tray upstairs close to midnight, the third-floor hallway was completely dark. She stopped at the top of the stairs. In all the weeks she had been there, that hallway had never been entirely dark, because every other light was always left on, and no one was allowed to turn them off. It was one of those unwritten rules of the house she had understood, without anyone ever needing to explain it. She set the tray on the floor. She went back down half a flight and stood there listening. From the foyer below came the sound of the side door latch turning. Not the sound of something being forced, but the sound of a lock being opened properly by someone who knew the code. Then came the sound of shoes on the hardwood floor, and it wasn't just one pair. Sloane turned and went back up, crossed the dark hallway in 7 steps, pushed open the bedroom door, and locked it behind her. Rafe was already sitting upright in bed. He had heard it too. He reached for the prosthetic leg standing beside the bedpost and began fitting it into place. And Sloane saw something she would remember for a very long time afterward. The hand of a man who had once made an entire harbor lower its voice was trembling because the brace lock wouldn't catch on the first try. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. He tried a second time. There wasn't enough time. He looked up and she looked down, and both of them understood the same thing, that in this room, at this moment, the only person who could stand up and walk to the door was her. He said her name once, only once, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before. He told her to go out through the back exit. Sloane didn't go out through the back exit. She ran to the wall beside the wardrobe, where there was a red glass fire alarm box she had noticed on her first day because of old professional habits, smashed the glass with the handle of the flashlight in her pocket, and pulled the lever down. The fire alarm throughout the entire house exploded to life all at once. It wasn't a bell. It was a wall of sound, pounding through the corridors over and over again, shaking the window frames, and with it the emergency lights came on, flashing through every passageway, turning the whole third floor into a white and red chaos no one could possibly navigate clearly. Then Sloane cracked the door open and screamed into that chaos. She screamed that there was a fire in the east wing, the master bedroom in the east wing, and she screamed in exactly the voice of someone who was truly panicking, and she kept screaming it again and again, until she heard the footsteps at the end of the hall turn around and run in the opposite direction. She shut the door. She locked it. She dragged the heavy wardrobe across the floor and wedged it against the door. And she did it alone, because the man behind her was still sitting on the edge of the bed, with the brace lock hanging open. Then she switched off the only table lamp. The two of them remained there in that flashing darkness, surrounded by the alarm, and she sat down on the floor with her back against the door, and for the next 7 minutes, neither one of them said a word. There were people running outside, voices calling to one another, doors slamming. Someone tried the handle to this room once, then left, because the shouting from the east wing was louder. Then came sirens from the driveway. Then everything began to slow. By the time Bishop returned, the alarm had been silenced, and every light in the house was on. They found a man trying to make his way downstairs by the servants' staircase, and he wasn't a stranger. It was Wade Kilbride, one of the security men, a man who had worked in the house for 4 years, a man who knew every door code, because he was the one assigned to change them. They handcuffed him in the second-floor hallway, and he sat on the floor without saying a word. Bishop went up to the third floor, pulled the wardrobe aside, and found the two of them still exactly where they had been. Rafe was sitting on the edge of the bed, with the prosthetic leg resting loosely in his hand, and he looked at the woman sitting on the floor with her back against the door. He said she should have run. Sloane looked up. She said she had nowhere left to run. The next morning, Rafe said nothing about the night before. He only told Bishop to send word downstairs, that there would be a meeting that afternoon, that everyone in charge was expected to be in the main dining room, and he said it in that low, even voice of his, like a wooden door closing. Bishop stood still for a moment, then asked if Rafe meant to go downstairs himself. Rafe said yes. Bishop left without asking anything else. By early afternoon, the problem revealed itself. Sloane entered the dressing room and found him sitting on the low bench with the prosthetic leg lying beside him, the brace lock still open. He had tried 4 times. The night before, he had spent too long sitting on the floor, and all morning he hadn't been able to elevate his leg because people had been coming and going constantly, and now the residual limb wouldn't fit into the socket. He didn't look at her. He said he would handle it himself, and told her to leave. Sloane closed the door. She walked to the linen cabinet, took out a roll of elastic bandage and a towel, then knelt on the floor in front of him. He told her to get up. She said that if he wanted to be downstairs before dark, he needed 20 minutes, and she needed him to sit still for those 20 minutes. He said he didn't need anyone doing this for him. She looked up at him and said she knew, and then she began. She did exactly what needed to be done and nothing more. She elevated his leg, wrapped the elastic bandage in the proper direction, neither too tightly nor too loosely, then laid the cool, damp towel over it, and sat on the floor to wait. For those 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. He stared straight out the window for the entire 20 minutes. Sloane watched the clock on the wall and looked at her own 2 hands. She had knelt on floors to do things like this hundreds of times in her old life, and she remembered that back then she had always talked to her patients while she worked, always told them some harmless little story so they would have somewhere else to place their attention. Now she understood that here, silence was the kinder thing. When enough time had passed, she removed the bandage. She fitted the liner, then the socket, and this time it went on. She tightened the strap, checked it, then tightened it 1 notch more. The lock clicked cleanly into place. Then she reached for the right leather shoe on the rack, the shoe custom made in London as the mate to the left one, the shoe that had been polished every week for all this time and had never once touched the ground. She loosened the laces, guided it onto the carbon fiber foot, and tied it again. She tied the knot exactly the way she had seen him tie the left shoe that morning. Rafe sat motionless from beginning to end, and not once did he look down. Later, when he thought back on it, he knew it was the most humiliating thing he had ever allowed another human being to do for him, more humiliating than the night he had lain on the floor of his own room in front of her, because that fall had been an accident, while this time he had sat still and allowed it to happen. But he knew something else too, and he knew it then, not only afterward. Her hands were steady. They didn't tremble once. She didn't stop once to look up and see whether he was all right, because that look was the thing that could kill a man. She did it the way someone did the work they knew how to do, and for those 20 minutes he wasn't a disabled man being pitied. He was simply a man who needed a strap tightened to the correct notch. She stood, brushed off her knees, then pulled the trouser leg down. It fell straight, covering everything from top to bottom, and when he stood, there was nothing left to see. She looked at him in the mirror and said no one would be able to tell. Rafe looked at his own reflection in the large mirror, a tall man in a dark suit, 2 identical black shoes resting evenly on the floor. He said he knew. He said that was the worst part. The grand staircase had 30 steps, and Rafe had known that number since he was a boy, because there had been one summer when he spent an entire month jumping down them 1 step at a time and counting. Now he stood at the top and looked down, and those 30 dark wooden steps stretched beneath him like the face of a cliff. He wasn't carrying a cane. The cane had been left behind on the bed in his room, and Sloane had looked at it, then at him, and she hadn't said a word, because she understood that there were some things that, once a man had to explain them, were already half ruined. He placed his left hand on the railing. The first step was the hardest, because it was the first. He lowered his right foot first, planted the whole foot against the wood, waited until he could feel the resistance traveling back up through the prosthetic leg and through the strap tightening around his thigh, and only then brought the left foot down after it. He took the second step a little faster. By the 5th, he had found the rhythm of it, and that rhythm was so slow that if anyone had been standing at the bottom looking up, they would have thought he was deliberately taking his time. But no one was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Sloane walked behind him, 2 steps back, on his right side, and she didn't reach out a hand or say a word. She stayed there because if he fell, she would be exactly where someone needed to be, and she knew she wasn't strong enough to catch him. But she also knew that hitting another body was always softer than hitting the edge of hardwood. At the 13th step, he had to stop. He didn't look down, and he didn't look up. He simply stood there with his left hand gripping the railing and breathed through his nose until the bright ring closing in around the edges of his vision widened again. Sloane stopped too, 2 steps behind him, and she looked out the window instead of looking at him. It was the only kindness she could offer him then. He continued. From the 20th step down, sweat began running along his spine, and by the time he reached the final step, the collar of his white shirt was dark with moisture at the back of his neck, where the jacket would hide it completely. He stood at the foot of the staircase for perhaps 10 breaths, adjusted his cuffs, and fastened the middle button of his suit jacket again. Then he walked toward the end of the hall, where the 2 wooden doors of the grand dining room stood closed. From inside came the sound of conversation, glasses touching, and someone laughing loudly. Sloane stepped ahead, took hold of the two brass handles, and pushed both doors open at once. The laughter cut off in the middle. There were 11 men in the room, and every one of them turned their heads at the same moment. The silence that fell over that room was so thick and heavy that Sloane could hear the fire crackling in the hearth along the side wall. One man shot to his feet and knocked over his glass of whiskey without even realizing it. Another lifted a hand to his mouth, then lowered it again. The man seated nearest the door let out a sound that might have been someone's name, but never quite became a word, because none of them had seen this man since the previous summer, because for all that time, the only thing they had known was a closed wooden door at the end of the dark third-floor hallway, and a voice coming from somewhere behind it. And now that voice was standing in the doorway of the grand dining room, wearing a perfectly fitted dark suit, shoulders straight, hands resting at his sides, standing on 2 feet. At the far end of the table stood Cormac Doyle. He was standing in the one place no one in this house was permitted to stand, one hand still resting on the back of the great chair, his glass halted halfway to his mouth. Rafe began to walk. He crossed the length of the room, moving past 11 men who stood as though nailed to the floor, moving through the roughly 6 steps he knew were the most dangerous, because the thick carpet distorted the feedback from the ground beneath him. He didn't sway once. He kept his shoulders from dipping, kept his head from nodding with every step, kept both arms swinging evenly, all the things he had practiced again and again in his room for the past 3 weeks, without ever telling anyone what he was practicing for. And not one person in that room noticed. Not one. He stopped exactly 1 step away from Doyle, and he said nothing. Doyle spoke first, and that was his first mistake that evening. He laughed and said the whole house was glad Rafe had finally decided to come downstairs, said that if someone had warned them, they would have prepared something more proper. Rafe didn't answer. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a phone, and placed it on the wooden tabletop directly in front of Doyle. He touched the screen once. In that silent room, the voice coming from the small speaker was clear enough to make out every word, and it was the voice of the man standing at the head of the table. It gave the name of the ship, it gave the dock number, it gave the time of day and the western entrance, then added that the man always went alone on inventory nights. The recording lasted less than 20 seconds. When it ended, there wasn't a person in the room who could be heard breathing. The whiskey glass in Doyle's hand came down onto the table, missing the coaster, and he didn't pick it up again. Rafe lifted the phone, slipped it back into his inside pocket, and began to speak. He spoke very slowly, and not once that entire evening did he raise his voice. He said that as of tonight, the South Docks no longer belonged to Doyle. He said all of Doyle's routes were being transferred to someone else. All of his accounts were being closed. Everyone working under him would begin taking orders from elsewhere starting tomorrow, and no one in this house was to take another call from him. When he finished, he went silent. And that silence was more frightening than anything he had just said. Doyle let out a dry laugh. He said Rafe couldn't do that he had been at those docks since Rafe's father was alive. Rafe said yes, that was true, and that was why Doyle was still standing there. Then he turned to Bishop and told him to escort Mr. Doyle out through the front door. Someone in the middle of the table spoke up, an older man, and said that if Doyle walked out through those gates, he would go straight to someone else. Rafe looked at him. He said he knew. He said that in this house, men paid with the truth, not with blood, and that his father had done things the other way for an entire lifetime, and the other way hadn't kept him alive even 1 day longer. He said that anyone who couldn't live under that rule was free to leave through the same door as Doyle right now, and he waited, and no one moved. Doyle walked out. He passed Sloane, who was standing beside the door, and he didn't look at her once, and the way he refused to look at her said more than anything he had said to her in that narrow, dark hallway. When he reached the doorway, Rafe called his name. Doyle stopped and turned, and in front of all 11 men in that room, in front of Bishop, in front of Gus standing silently at the far end of the table, Rafe bent down, gripped the right leg of his trousers, and pulled it up. The black carbon fiber appeared beneath the chandelier light, smooth and cold and unlike anything that belonged to a human body. Somewhere behind him, someone drew in a breath. Rafe didn't look down at his leg. He looked straight into Doyle's face. He said Doyle had sold that route because he believed the thing that came back from the docks that day would never stand again. He said Doyle had been half right. He said now everyone in this room had seen it, and Doyle should look carefully, because this was the last time he would ever get to see it, and Rafe was still standing at the head of the table. Then he let the trouser leg fall. It dropped straight and covered everything, and there was nothing left to see. Doyle turned away. The great doors closed behind him. Rafe pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, and he lowered himself slowly, with complete control. Never allowing anyone to see that sitting was what his entire body had been begging him to do for the last 20 minutes. He told everyone to sit. They all sat down at once. He said, "Now we begin." The meeting went on for nearly another hour, and throughout that hour Rafe sat with his back straight, answered each man in turn, and revealed nothing. When the last man rose to leave, he remained seated until the 2 wooden doors had fully closed. Then he stood, and Sloane saw his hand grip the edge of the table 1 beat longer than necessary. She didn't head for the grand staircase. She went ahead into the side corridor, to the small elevator the house had installed back in his grandfather's time for carrying supplies, and she pulled the folding iron gate aside. He looked at it and said nothing. He stepped inside. She pulled the gate shut and pressed the button, and the moment the little car lifted away from the floor, he collapsed. It wasn't a fall. His back slid down the wooden wall, and he sank onto the elevator floor, both legs stretched out in front of him, his head tipped back against the paneling, and there was nothing left on his face that he could hold in place. Sloane knelt beside him. She didn't ask if he was all right. She pulled up his trouser leg, loosened the strap, found the lock, and released it. In that cramped space, the sound of the lock opening didn't sound mechanical. It sounded like a breath, the kind someone had been holding far too long and was finally allowed to let out. He began to shake. It wasn't from cold, and it wasn't entirely from pain. It was the trembling of a body that had been forced to hold something tightly in place for 2 straight hours, and was finally being allowed to release it, and it traveled from his shoulders all the way down to his fingertips in waves, one after another. Sloane took off her outer jacket and laid it over his legs. She sat down on the elevator floor across from him and said nothing. The elevator had reached the 3rd floor long ago, but she didn't open the gate. Then he began to speak. He spoke to the ceiling of the wooden car, not to her. He said there was a box on the desk in his room, and inside it was something that could make all of this stop in less than 2 minutes. And he knew exactly where it was, and he had known for 7 months. He said his mother's name was Delia. He said she had suffered from back pain since he was a boy, the kind of pain that never really went away, the kind that wouldn't kill a person but wouldn't let them truly live with it either. He said they prescribed something for her. Then they prescribed more. Then they prescribed more again, and not one of the people who signed those papers ever stayed in the room with her long enough to see what was happening. He said that when he was 19, he was the one who found her. He stopped for a very long time after that sentence, and didn't give a single detail more, and Sloane didn't ask. He said everyone in this house had always thought he was stubborn. He said even Gus thought so. He said no one had ever asked him why, not even the people paid to find answers for him, and he had no intention of explaining himself to people who didn't ask. Then he went silent. The shaking had eased, but it hadn't stopped, and he closed his eyes, and Sloane saw his jaw tighten in the rhythm she had learned to recognize. He said her name. Then he said the thing he had never said to anyone in his entire life. Not to his father, not to his uncle, not to the man who had dragged him out of the ship's hold that day. He said, "Please," he said, "sing." Sloane didn't ask him to repeat himself, didn't comment, didn't add a single ounce of weight to the moment. She only leaned back against the wooden wall, looked up at the small light in the elevator ceiling, and began to sing that old sea folk song, the one about men going out to sea and lamps left burning in the windows. Her voice cracked on the second high note because her throat was still raw from the night before, and she let it crack and kept singing. Outside, in the dark 3rd-floor hallway, an old man stood motionless, about 3 steps from the elevator door. Gus had followed them upstairs, moving slowly, because all evening he had been so afraid that he hadn't dared take his eyes off his grandson's back. He heard everything. He heard the name of the woman who had given birth to the boy spoken aloud in this house for the first time in so many years. He heard the word "please," and he heard the voice break on the high note. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and went downstairs, moving quietly enough that no one inside that wooden car would ever know he had been there. 3 days later, Gus sent for her in his study. He didn't invite her to sit right away as he had the first time. He stood beside the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, looking into the burning coals, and he let her stand there for perhaps half a minute before turning around. On the desk lay a check already filled out and a neatly clipped stack of papers. He pushed both toward her. The amount on the check was larger than everything Sloane had earned in her entire professional life put together. The papers beside it were the contract for a small 2-bedroom house in Newport, with a backyard, 4 blocks from the shore, already transferred and waiting only for a signature. Gus said he wasn't a man who liked to circle around a subject, so he would speak plainly. He said he had lived long enough to know what was happening in this house, that he wasn't blind, and that he was grateful to her in a way he would never be able to put into words. Then he said the rest. He said his grandson would get well, and when he did, he would have to do the things a man in his position was expected to do, and among those things was marrying someone whose name didn't make people turn their heads. He said he didn't mean to insult her. He said he was only describing the world both of them lived in, and that world had rules even his money couldn't change. He said she could remain in this house as long as she wished, be paid generously, be cared for properly, but only in that place, and never beyond it. Sloane picked up the check. She looked at it for a long time, and Gus stood beside the fireplace waiting, and perhaps he thought that silence was the silence of someone surrendering. Then she took her phone from her apron pocket, opened her banking app, and began tapping right there where she stood, upright in the middle of the room, without asking permission to sit. She entered the rehabilitation center's account number, the number she had known by heart since spring, and transferred the entire amount without keeping a single dollar. She turned the screen toward him so he could see the confirmation. Then she placed the check and the house contract back on the desk, pushed them gently toward him, and said she thanked him for the money, because it had just bought her sister another 2 years of being able to stand, and she would be grateful to him for that for the rest of her life. Then she went on and said that now he had nothing left with which to keep her there. She said the money was gone. She wasn't taking the house, and if she climbed those stairs again tomorrow morning, it wouldn't be because he was paying her. It would be because she wanted to. Gus looked at her for a very long time. He was a man who had sat in this room for 40 years and had watched a great many people take his money, and he knew how to read every one of them. He said nothing. He only nodded once, very slightly, and in that nod was something even he hadn't yet found a name for. That afternoon, she went upstairs to clean the room while he was downstairs with Bishop. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the nightstand to wipe it out, and it stuck. She drew the entire drawer out of its frame, and a bundle of envelopes fell onto the floor. They had been shoved into the empty space behind the drawer, pushed deep inside, in the kind of place where people hid things when they didn't want to see them every day but couldn't bring themselves to throw them away. Sloane picked them up. There were perhaps 6 or 7 letters, postmarked at regular monthly intervals, all written in the same rounded, slanting woman's handwriting, all sent from an address on Fenner Street in Providence, and in the upper left corner of every envelope was a name written in blue ink, Teresa Vance. Not one of them had been opened. The seals were still intact, smooth and untouched, never once cut by a letter opener. At the bottom of that hidden space, fastened together with a paper clip, was a stack of cash transfer receipts, also dated at regular monthly intervals, all bearing the same recipient's name, and the amounts on them were so large that Sloane had to count the digits twice. She sat down on the floor with the envelopes in her hands. The man downstairs had been sending money to this woman all this time, month after month, without missing a single one. And month after month, he hadn't dared open a single word of what she had written back to him. She placed the stack of envelopes on the dining table in his room that evening without saying a word, and she stood there waiting. He looked at them, and his whole body went rigid in a way she had never seen before, not even on the worst nights. He told her to leave them exactly where they were and get out. She asked whether he had read any of them. He said it was none of her business. That was the first refusal. 2 days later, she brought it up again, this time while he was sitting by the window, and she said that woman had kept writing all this time to a man who had never once answered, and she asked whether he had ever wondered what she might be waiting for. He said she was waiting for money. He had sent the money, and that was the end of it. That was the second refusal, and there was so much irritation in his voice when he said it that even he could hear it. The third time was on a rainy afternoon, and this time he truly lost his temper. He said she didn't understand anything, that some things were better left untouched, that the woman was managing to live and he was managing to live, and the day he knocked on her door would be the day both of them lost whatever part of life they were still managing to hold together. Sloane let him finish. Then she asked him only one question. She asked whether he knew what it felt like to live for 14 months, while no one was willing to sit down and tell you the truth. When she had said it, she walked out and closed the door behind her. 3 days later, he told Bishop to bring the car around. The house on Fenner Street stood at the end of a row of faded, pale yellow wooden homes, with cracked concrete steps and a pot of dead chrysanthemums beside them. Rafe stood at the foot of those steps for a very long time. Bishop remained in the car. Sloane stood one step behind him, and she said nothing. And when he finally climbed the steps and knocked on the door, she followed and stood behind him. The woman who opened it looked to be in her mid-50s, her hair tied neatly back, a blue sweater on her shoulders, a dish towel still in one hand. She looked at him. She didn't ask who he was. She only stood there gripping the towel, and the two of them remained silent for so long that Sloane thought the door was about to close. Then Teresa Vance stepped back and told them to come in. The kitchen was small and clean, with a wooden table pushed against the wall and 3 chairs. A photograph was held to the refrigerator by a magnet, showing a man in a baseball cap standing beside a truck, smiling, one hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun. Rafe sat down, and it took him a moment to settle himself properly. He didn't begin with a greeting. He said, "You've written me 7 letters, and I haven't opened a single one." Teresa set the dish towel down. She said she knew. She said she kept writing because she didn't know what else to do. Rafe placed both hands on the table and looked down at them, and then he said the thing he had been swallowing for all this time, saying it very slowly, one sentence at a time, like a man pulling something rusted out of the place where it had been buried. He said that night at the docks, when everything had gone wrong, he had been trapped and Eddie was farther inside. He said Bishop found him but couldn't pull him out. He said the smoke was dropping lower, and the whole compartment was about to collapse. And Bishop asked him one question, and he heard that question clearly, and he had been completely conscious. He said he knew exactly what the question meant. He said he nodded. He said they dragged him out, and they made it out, and Eddie didn't. He said that all this time the whole city had called him a survivor. While he knew he hadn't survived, he had chosen. He said he had been given a choice that night, and Eddie hadn't been given one at all, and that was the entire difference between the 2 men on that ship. He said she had every right not to forgive him. Then he said she had the right to know, and he had taken that right away from her all this time, simply because he hadn't been brave enough to climb those steps. Teresa Vance said nothing for a very long time. She looked at him, then at the photograph on the refrigerator, then down at her own hands. Her eyes reddened, but she didn't cry. She said she had figured it out a long time ago, not the details, but the shape of it, because she had lived with a man who worked the docks for 19 years, and she knew how that world worked. She said she didn't forgive him. She said it plainly, without cruelty, simply as a fact placed on the table the way someone might set down a plate. She said she didn't think she could forgive him. Not today, and perhaps not ever. Then she stood. She walked to the stove, poured a cup of coffee from the pot that was still warm on the counter, brought it back, and placed it in front of him. She pushed the sugar bowl toward him, then she sat down again and said, "Sit there, finish it, then go home." That was everything that woman could give him, and she gave all of it. Rafe looked at the cup on the table. Then his shoulders began to shake, and he raised one hand to cover his eyes, and it was the first time in her life that Sloane had ever seen him cry. There wasn't a sound. Teresa Vance sat quietly across the table and let him cry in her kitchen, and she didn't offer him a tissue or say a word of comfort, and the late afternoon light lay slantwise across the wooden table between them. On the drive back from Fenner Street, Rafe said nothing the entire way, and it wasn't until the car turned through the gates that he spoke. He told Bishop to find him everything that still remained about the case that had cost the woman sitting in the back seat her professional license. Sloane turned to say something, and he raised a hand to stop her. He said she had sat in his room night after night listening to things no one else was allowed to hear, and not once had he asked what she had lost. He said this wasn't repayment. This was something that should have been done a long time ago. 3 nights later, Bishop spread a stack of papers across the desk in the study, printed from places he didn't explain, and pointed to a single page. It was the original staffing schedule from that night, the version before it had been altered. Sloane bent over it. Then she straightened and said this was wrong. She said there had only been 2 people that night, her and the resident physician. She had repeated that for 14 months to everyone willing to sit down and listen to her. Bishop said nothing. He simply moved his finger down to the 3rd line. There was a name there. Sloane read it, then had to read it again, and then she sat down because her knees could no longer hold her. She said, "I know her," she said. "She was the one who trained me during my first month. She was the one who showed me how to reorganize the medication cart so it wouldn't become a mess. She had worked there for 17 years. Bishop turned to the next page. There was a copy of a resignation letter, signed exactly 9 days after that night, and attached to it was a 4-page agreement, whose second clause prohibited the signer from discussing anything related to internal operations with any third party, in any form, indefinitely. They found Marlene Hobbs in a small town 3 hours away, in a ground-floor apartment with windows overlooking a parking lot. She opened the door, saw Sloane standing there, and reached up to grip the doorframe. She didn't invite them in right away. She simply stood there looking at Sloane for a long time, and it wasn't the look of someone surprised. It was the look of someone who had waited so long that she no longer knew how to react when the thing she had been waiting for finally arrived. Then she turned, went to the closet, pulled out an old shoebox, and carried it over to the table. Inside was a copy of the original staffing schedule, a copy of the incident report she had written by hand that very night and submitted twice, and a sheet of paper recording the date and time of each submission, along with the name of the person who had received it. She said she had submitted that report twice. She said the first time they told her the matter was under review. She said the second time they called her upstairs and handed her that agreement, and she signed it because she still had 9 years to go before retirement and because she had no one standing behind her. She said she had kept this box all this time. She said she kept it because she always thought someone would come and ask. A lawyer, a reporter, someone from the board, anyone at all. She said she had waited through an entire winter, then a summer, then another winter, and not one person had ever come to ask. Then her voice broke, and she said that all this time she had believed Sloane was angry with her for staying silent, and she hadn't dared call because she didn't know how to begin. Sloane stood up from her chair. She said, "I didn't even know you existed." She said, "For the past 14 months, I believed there were only 2 people in that room that night, and I believed it because that was what they wrote in the record and handed to me to read." The 2 women stood facing each other in that ground-floor apartment, an open shoebox between them, and for a very long time neither of them could say anything more. The name of the person who had signed for Marlene Hobbs's report was a name Bishop had seen somewhere before, and it took him 2 days to remember where. He went up to the study and told Rafe he needed the safe opened. Rafe walked to the painting on the wall himself, swung it aside, and turned the dial. There was no money inside the safe, no gun, no typed documents. There was only a worn leather-bound ledger, the one his father had used and his grandfather before him. Everything recorded in blue ink, because anything that went online belonged to someone else. Rafe set it on the desk and began turning the pages. Then he stopped. Between 2 pages, a jagged line ran close along the spine. One page had been torn out. He stared at it for a long time. Then he called Gus. The old man came in, looked at the open ledger on the desk, and didn't ask what had happened. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, like a man who had always known this day would come and simply hadn't known which day it would be. Rafe asked who tore it out. Gus said, "I did." Rafe asked when. Gus said after the night at the docks, while you were still in the hospital. Rafe asked why. Gus was quiet for a moment, then said that he himself had established that channel, back in Rafe's father's time, back before Rafe even knew how to read. He said that in those days they needed somewhere for money to pass through without anyone asking questions, and a hospital charity fund was the cleanest place in the world, because no one in the world went digging through a hospital charity fund. He said that when Doyle took over the South Docks, Doyle inherited that route, and Gus had allowed him to inherit it, and that had been Gus's mistake. He said he tore out the page because at the time his grandson had just lost part of his body, had just lost a man who had been with him for 19 years, and Gus thought that if he put this on his back too, the boy would never stand again. He said he had done it to protect him. Rafe said, "You decided for me what I could bear." He didn't say it loudly, and perhaps that was why it left the old man sitting so still in his chair. He said, "Just like you did with my father all those years." Bishop placed the rest of the papers on the desk. He said he had finished cross-checking everything. Each line in the ledger contained only a 3-character code, never a name, and that had been the rule of this house since Rafe's grandfather's time. The man in charge approved limits but never asked for names, because if you didn't know a name, you couldn't give one up. Bishop said he had deciphered the code on the 4th line. He read it aloud. The Halloran Fund. Sloane was standing by the window, and she turned around. That was the name of the place that had once printed her name into a file, and then handed it to the press. Bishop went on, his voice as even as ever, and said that the person who had signed for Mrs. Hobbs's report, the person whose name appeared on the silence agreement, and the person listed on the governing board of that fund were all the same person. He said that was why that person hadn't had to fear anyone for the past 14 months. Rafe rose from the desk. He walked to the window and stood there for a long time with his hands clasped behind his back. Then, without turning, he said that he had approved that line. He said he had signed it 4 times a year, ever since his father died. He said he had looked at those 3 letters and put his pen to the page, and never once asked what they meant, because the rules of this house said it was safer not to ask, and he had found that rule very convenient. He turned and looked at Sloane. He said he had never ordered anyone to destroy her. He said he had only signed off on a number, and never asked where it flowed. Then he said the sentence she would think about many times in the years that followed. He said, "It turns out not asking is also a way of giving an order." No one in the room spoke. Gus still sat in the chair with both hands resting on his knees, and he didn't look up. Bishop stood beside the cabinet, silent. Sloane looked at the man standing by the window, and she understood that he had just lost the last thing he had still been able to keep about himself, the belief that, whatever else he had done, at least he had never touched people who weren't involved. He told Bishop to get everything on that fund, everything, without leaving out a single page. Bishop took 5 days. He didn't say where he had gone, and no one asked. On the 5th night, he returned and spread a stack of papers across the desk, much thinner than the ones before, and he said the most important thing was on a single page. It was the original access log from the medical records system, the part someone had deleted but hadn't completely erased, because it still existed on a backup server no one remembered. It showed an account that had logged into the record that night and altered it. The account didn't belong to the man who ran the hospital. It belonged to his daughter. Sloane read the name and sat very still. Camille Vaughn, a resident physician who hadn't even completed her 2nd year at the time. Someone Sloane still remembered standing in the hallway near dawn drinking coffee from the vending machine. Someone who had a habit of biting her lip when she read medical orders. Bishop turned to the next page and said it went further than that. He read out 3 dates. 3 times the woman had submitted her resignation over the past 14 months, and 3 times all 3 resignations had been withdrawn in less than a week, each time bearing her father's signature approving the withdrawal. Then he placed the final sheet of paper on the desk, and he said this was the part that mattered most. It was an internal memorandum in which Camille Vaughn's name was mentioned not as a doctor, but as collateral, something offered to reassure another party that the man running the hospital would never dare speak. Rafe picked up the paper and read it. Then he set it down and said he needed one night. He said that with what was lying on this desk, he could make both father and daughter lose everything before morning. Their positions, their licenses, their house, even the name they had taken from her, and he said he wouldn't have to lay a hand on anyone to do it. He said all she had to do was nod. Sloane rose from her chair. She walked to the window, stood there for a moment, then turned back and said no. He asked why. She said that if she got her name back by breaking someone else, then that name would still be dirty, only now it would be dirty in her own way. She said that for 14 months, a system had crushed her, without anyone inside it needing to hate her. They had simply chosen the easiest person to push. She said that if she sat in this room now and picked out the easiest person to push back, then she would have become exactly the thing that had ruined her life, and she wouldn't do that. Rafe looked at her for a long time. Then he asked what she wanted. Sloane said she wanted the woman to speak. She said she didn't need that woman broken. She needed that woman to open her mouth, and a broken person couldn't speak. A broken person only knew how to stay silent. 3 days later, the 2 women sat across from each other in a small diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and free coffee refills. Camille Vaughn arrived 10 minutes late, and when she walked in, her face was deathly pale. She sat down with both hands on the table and began speaking immediately, speaking very quickly, saying she hadn't known what happened afterward, that she had only been told everything had been taken care of, that she had asked questions and been told not to ask any more. Sloane let her finish. She didn't place the papers on the table. She didn't mention a single name. When Camille stopped and sat there with both hands trembling on the plastic tabletop, Sloane asked her only one question. She asked, "Since that night, have you slept through a single night?" Camille Vaughn looked up. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Then her face broke apart, and she folded over the table and cried, crying the way someone cries after holding something inside their chest for so long that when it finally comes out, it no longer has any shape at all. She said she had submitted her resignation 3 times. She said every time, her father sat her down and explained that if she left, everything would collapse, that people would reopen the whole thing, that the entire family would lose everything, and every time she believed him. She said she had believed he was saving her. Sloane pushed the glass of water across the table. She said, "He wasn't saving you, he was keeping you there." She said there was a memorandum in which Camille's name had been used like something placed down as collateral, and she said she wouldn't show it to her today, because she didn't want Camille to speak, because she had been backed into a corner. She said, "I want you to speak because you choose to." Camille Vaughn wiped her face with the back of her hand. She sat up straight, and she asked what she needed to do. The petition to reopen the case was filed with the State Medical Board the following week, accompanied by a copy of the original staffing schedule, Marlene Hobbs's handwritten report, the system access log, and a voluntary statement signed by Camille Vaughn. The board set a date for a public hearing, and the lawyer Rafe had hired made it clear from the beginning that this was an administrative hearing concerning a professional license, not a criminal trial, that the only question before the board was whether the revocation of the license had been proper, and that anyone had the right to submit documents and sit in the room. He said that was the simple part. Then he told them the rest. He placed a sheet of paper on the table and said he had a contact in the federal prosecutor's office, and that person had told him something. Cormac Doyle hadn't left the state at all. He hadn't run to New York, hadn't gone down to Florida, hadn't disappeared the way men stripped of their power usually did. 3 weeks after the night in the grand dining room, he had walked into a federal building in downtown Providence on his own and sat down to talk, and now he was a cooperating witness. The lawyer said that as long as Raphael Marchetti remained inside this house, he was still only a name in the testimony of a traitor, a name that could take years to build into a case. He said the day Rafe walked into a public room where there were reporters, cameras, and an official record listing the names and addresses of everyone who spoke, that name would have a face. He said he had a duty to tell him that beforehand, and when he had finished, he closed his briefcase and left. 4 people remained in the study. Gus spoke first, and he was no longer speaking in the voice of an advisor. He came around the desk, stood in front of his grandson, and told him not to go. He said Rafe's father had kept this house intact for 40 years because of one thing and one thing only. He had never allowed anyone to photograph him in a public place. He said submit the documents, hire the lawyers, spend as much money as necessary, but don't walk into that room yourself. His voice trembled when he said that he had already buried Rafe's father, that he had spent an entire summer sitting in hospital hallways the year before, and he couldn't do that again. Bishop was much briefer. He said let him take the files and submit them in Rafe's place, that there were ways to handle any signature, that no one was required to appear in person simply to file documents with a board. He said the last sentence very quietly. You don't owe anyone this. Then the others spoke too. The men who had sat in the grand dining room that night and had stood when he told them to stand, and every one of them said the same thing in different ways. Sloane said nothing. She stood by the window and looked at him, and inside her head 2 things were pulling against each other. One telling her she should open her mouth and tell him not to go, and the other knowing that if she did, she would be taking from him the very right she had spent 14 months trying to reclaim for herself. She clenched her teeth and said nothing. Rafe sat still from beginning to end. He listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt anyone, didn't argue with anyone, didn't explain himself. When the last person finished speaking, the room fell silent, and that silence lasted long enough for all of them to begin believing that he had finally understood. Then he placed his hands on the desk and stood. He rose slowly, with control, exactly the way he had risen ever since the night in the grand dining room. He fastened the middle button of his suit jacket. He didn't answer any of the 4 people in the room. He walked to the door, and at the threshold he stopped for exactly 1 beat without turning around, then went out into the hallway. The hearing room was on the 2nd floor of a red brick administrative building in downtown Providence, and it was much smaller than Sloane had imagined during the 14 months she had spent thinking about this day. There was a long dais across the front for the 5 board members, a table for whoever was testifying, and 4 rows of wooden benches behind it. She arrived 30 minutes early and sat alone in the front row, both hands resting on the case file in her lap. People began drifting in one by one. A young reporter from the local newspaper took a seat in the 2nd row and set out a recorder. The head of the hospital arrived with his own attorney, walked past her without looking, and sat down across the aisle with the manner of a man attending an ordinary meeting. The chairperson struck the gavel. They read the case number, read her name, then read aloud the decision revoking her license from the previous winter, in the flat voice of someone reading a document they had read hundreds of times before. Sloane sat there listening to her own name being spoken in a public room for the first time since that day, and she realized both her hands had gone ice cold. Then the door behind her opened. It wasn't the cautious opening of someone arriving late. It opened all the way and stayed that way. The entire room turned. Raphael Marchetti walked in under the full light of day, walking on two legs, his right hand resting on a polished black cane that he carried not like something he needed to lean on, but like something that belonged to him. He wore a dark suit, no sunglasses, nothing on his head, and he walked straight down the center aisle beneath the overhead lights, while the recorder in the second row continued running. Behind him came the lawyer carrying two leather briefcases, then Bishop with a box of files, then Marlene Hobbs in the nicest coat she owned, and finally Camille Vaughn, walking with both hands clasped tightly together. The head of the hospital turned to look, and Sloane saw the color leave his face when he recognized the woman at the end of the line. The chairperson asked who Rafe was and what business he had there. The lawyer stood and gave his client's name very clearly, very slowly, clearly enough for the recorder in the second row to capture every syllable, and said that his client had come to submit financial documents concerning the Halloran Hospital Charity Fund during the period relevant to the case under review. One of the board members leaned down and said something to the person beside him. The chairperson asked whether Rafe wished to make a statement. Rafe stepped up to the witness table, and he didn't sit down. He said he would be brief. He said money had passed through that fund for many years, that he was the person who had approved the limits on those transfers, and that he wouldn't stand there and tell the board he hadn't known what he was signing, because he had known he was signing something he had chosen not to ask about. He said the man sitting across the aisle had altered a record and placed the blame on a nurse who had no lawyer, and that man had been able to do it for 14 months, because he believed there was a shadow behind him, large enough that no one would dare ask questions. Then Rafe said the sentence the entire room would remember, and he didn't raise his voice when he said it, his eyes fixed on the chairperson's dais. He said, "I didn't come here to be a good man," he said. "I came here to return what my machine took from her." He placed the file on the clerk's table and sat down in the front row, 3 seats away from Sloane, and he didn't look at her once for the rest of that morning. Marlene Hobbs was called first. She opened the shoebox right there on the table, and her hands trembled as she read every line of the report she had written by hand that night, the date and time she submitted it the first time, the date and time she submitted it the second time, and the name of the person who had received it. When opposing counsel stood and mentioned the agreement she had signed, Rafe's lawyer was on his feet before the man could finish the sentence, placing a stack of papers on the table and stating that a silence provision wasn't enforceable when it was being used to conceal the very conduct under investigation. The chairperson reviewed it, asked one question, then allowed Mrs. Hobbs to continue. Camille Vaughn was called next. She sat down, gave her name, then remained silent for quite a while before beginning, and when she did begin, she didn't read from any paper. She said she was the one who had signed the medical order that night. She said she was the one who had logged into the record. She said she wasn't the one who altered it. The entire room went completely still, and across the aisle came the harsh scrape of a chair against the tile floor. They had to call for order twice before the room settled again. Sloane listened to everything, and she didn't cry. She sat very straight and listened to her truth being spoken by other mouths in a public room, and she realized that all this time what she had wanted wasn't to win. She had only wanted to be present in a room where people didn't speak about her as though she were a newspaper headline. In the last row, against the wall, a woman around 40 in a gray coat had sat silently from beginning to end, taking no notes and speaking to no one. When Rafe stepped toward the clerk's table, she had raised her phone to chest height and taken one photograph, only one, without a flash, then slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and sat quietly again. The board issued its decision 11 days later. Sloane Merrick's professional license was fully restored, the disciplinary record was voided, and the written ruling stated clearly that the previous revocation had been based on documents that had been altered. Along with that decision, the board referred the entire case file to the State Attorney General's office, and within a week, the head of Halloran Hospital was suspended from his position and a criminal investigation was opened. Camille Vaughn surrendered her medical license through the proper procedure, voluntarily, without appeal, and in the final petition she submitted to the board, there was a handwritten line at the bottom of the page that the clerk read aloud before closing the session. It said that she had waited 14 months for someone to ask her one question. On the afternoon the decision was announced, Rafe's lawyer came to the house in Ardmore one final time. He didn't bring his briefcase. He sat down, accepted a glass of water, and said plainly that he had a duty to tell Rafe what the situation really was. He said Rafe had just bought that woman her clean name back, and the price had already been entered into the ledger. He said the photograph taken inside the hearing room was now sitting in a file inside a federal building, together with his name, his address, and a transcript recording every word he had spoken that day. He said they weren't going to arrest him this week, and probably not next month either, because testimony from a man like Doyle needed a great deal of other evidence behind it before anyone could use it. But he said that from now on there would be a car parked across the street from the gates of his house, sometimes gray, sometimes blue, and it would be there for years, and Rafe would have to live with that every morning when he opened the curtains. He asked whether Rafe understood. Rafe said, "I understand." The lawyer nodded, finished his water, and left. Gus was the one who drove him home from the administrative building when the hearing ended, and he drove himself, refusing to let anyone else come with them. For the entire 40-minute drive, he didn't say a word. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't ask how Rafe was doing. Rafe sat in the passenger seat looking out through the window and said nothing either. When the car finally stopped on the gravel drive in front of the steps, Gus shut off the engine and sat there a while longer, with both hands still resting on the steering wheel. Then he said that Rafe's father would never have done what Rafe had done that morning. He said it wasn't because the man hadn't cared about anyone, but because he had believed this house could survive only if no one ever saw it. Then Gus turned toward him, and his eyes were red, and he said, "I'm glad you're not like him." He opened the car door and got out before his grandson had time to answer. At the end of that month, a hospital in Boston sent Sloane an offer to return to work, in exactly the position she had held before, in exactly the same specialty. She read the letter twice, then put it away in a drawer, and 3 days later, she took it out again and began packing her suitcase. She did it one afternoon while he was downstairs, and she packed neatly, and she didn't write a note, because she had spent 2 weeks thinking through this decision and had arrived at only one answer. There was a car parked across the road outside the gates. There was a file inside a federal building, and she understood that the woman whose face and name had just become known throughout the state because of a public hearing was the last person that man should allow anyone to see standing beside him. He found her on the stone embankment behind the house, where the lawn broke away into a strip of jagged rock, and the January sea moved below them, gray and restless. The wind cut across both their faces and made their eyes water without needing any other reason. He hadn't brought any papers with him. He didn't mention money, didn't mention the house in Newport that his grandfather still kept in a drawer, didn't mention the power that still made an entire harbor lower its voice when his name was spoken. He stood beside her, bracing the black cane against the stone for balance, and looked out at the sea. Then he said he knew what she was planning to do, and he knew why. He said she was thinking that if she left, his burden would become lighter. He said she had calculated wrong. He said that for 7 months before she walked through those gates, he had lain inside a boarded-up room with all the money, servants, doctors, and power anyone could want, and he said he had possessed every one of those things, and still couldn't stand up. He said the only thing he had left that was worth saying today was this, that he didn't need a nurse, he had never needed a nurse, and she wasn't anyone's secret, and never would be. He said, "Stay." Spring came late to that stretch of coast, and it wasn't until the end of April that the garden behind the children's hospital was warm enough for tables and chairs to be set outside. The plaque mounted on the brick wall beside the entrance bore the name of the music therapy program, and beneath that name was a smaller line saying that the program had been established in memory of a woman named Delia Marchetti, who had lived for many years with a pain that no one had been willing to sit beside long enough to see. Sloane stood on the steps with a new employee badge hanging around her neck, a badge bearing her name and her professional title, and she had worn it all morning while still reaching up from time to touch it just to make sure it was real. Marlene Hobbs had arrived early, wearing a new white coat, and she had spent the first hour reorganizing the cart of musical instruments so everything would be easier to find, exactly the way she had taught Sloane years earlier to organize a medication cart. Teresa Vance arrived close to noon. She didn't stay long. She walked once around the garden, stopped to read the plaque on the wall, then turned and gave one nod to the man standing beside the fence. Only one, nothing more. She still hadn't forgiven him, and they both knew it, but she had come, and in the world they lived in, one person choosing to walk through that gate carried more weight than any words could have. In the garden, Junie stood among a group of children singing a song about a seagull that stole French fries. She sang very loudly, missed the rhythm in almost every line, forgot the middle verse, and invented another one that was even funnier. And all the children sang along even more badly, and everyone burst into laughter beneath the sunlight. The yellow bow was still tied, crooked to one side, just as it always was. Rafe stood beside the wooden fence, with one hand resting on the handle of his black cane, and he watched the scene for a very long time. He still used the cane. On nights when the weather turned, when the wind changed direction and damp air rolled in from the sea, the pain still returned to the same place, in a foot that no longer existed, and it hadn't eased at all from the first day. The only difference was that now there were two people in that room, and there was no longer a box of medication on the bedside table, only a small lamp left burning through the night, and a singing voice that cracked on the high notes. Across the road outside the gates of their home, a car was still parked there, gray on some days, blue on others, and both of them knew it was there, and both of them had chosen to live with it. The story of Rafe and Sloane leaves us with something very simple: that when someone takes your name away from you, you must reclaim it with truth, not with fear, and that indifference, the habit of signing without asking, of turning away without looking, can destroy a human life just as surely as any deliberate cruelty. It also reminds us that a person doesn't have to be whole to deserve love, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone who has fallen isn't a hand that pulls them to their feet, but the belief that they still have enough strength to stand on their own. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with anyone you believe might need to hear it too, and subscribe to our channel so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did you feel about Sloane and Rafe's journey? And which moment left you sitting in silence? Please write a few lines below so that we can hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, happiness, and peace in your life each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.